Hi, I'm Phil Bernberg. Welcome to another session of the Potter's Roundtable from Washington Street Studios. This is the third talk in our series of the different steps that occur during the normal pottery making process. Last time we talked about drying clay, so today we're going to talk about the next step, which is bisque firing.
Welcome to the Potter's Roundtable, a monthly podcast where we share our passion for the ceramic arts and a collection of topics specific to potters. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Enjoy the show.
Bisque firing, for a definition of bisque firing, the word bisque firing, actually the term has been used in several different ways, but the main definition of bisque firing is primarily to strengthen the clay and secondarily to remove all the remaining water from the clay. But there are two terms that have been applied to this firing historically. First one, of course, is bisque firing, and the original meaning of bisque firing actually was a firing that was performed at a higher temperature than the glaze firing. And this was done. Was used and still is used commercially for several reasons. For one thing, if by firing to the final maturation temperature of the clay and without being glazed, the pots can be supported in various forms so that it reduces warping and slumping of the ware. And the main purpose is to cut losses. And so this way, the pottery can be examined after the high firing when the clay is mature, to look for defects, and any rejects can be eliminated at that point. Then the process can go on to the glazing, and then the glaze firing is done at a lower temperature than the initial bisque firing. So it's primarily a means of eliminating defects in the pieces early in the process. So you don't have to wait till the whole process is complete before you identify or find defects in the pieces. The second term is biscuit firing, and a biscuit firing is a firing in which the initial firing is at a lower temperature than the final glaze firing. I think these terms originally were British in terms of their origin. But so actually what we're doing in most cases today, we're doing biscuit firings. But we tend to, at least in the United States, we don't make this distinction between these two terms anymore, between bisque and biscuit. We just call everything a bisque, even though technically we're firing at a lower temperature than the final glaze firing. So relative to the two goals that I mentioned, or the two achievements in a bisque firing, strengthening the clay and removing the water, let's talk a little bit first of all about strengthening of the clay. There are three changes that occur during the firing. The first one is that the clay minerals, which we talked about during the first talk when we were speaking about what is clay, the clay minerals actually are changed and they're no longer clay minerals. They become ceramic materials. And what we call clay, and we continue to refer to it as clay throughout the whole process, is actually technically no longer clay because, for one thing, it doesn't get soft when it gets wet. The properties have completely changed. It doesn't get soft when it gets wet. It doesn't absorb as much water when it's exposed to water, and it isn't plastic at all. In most cases, when we fire at sort of a moderate bisque temperature, what we've actually produced is what's called metakaolin, which means changed kaolin, and free silica. So the material at that point, after the bisque, is technically a ceramic, even though we continue to call it clay for convenience. The second thing that happens during the firing, in terms of strengthening the clay, is the clay particles are bonded together. It's called sintering, S-I-N-T-E-R-I-N-G, sintering. And the particles are actually become attached to each other in a slight way, and it strengthens the whole piece. So the clay itself, the body of clay, becomes stronger and harder and more handleable, which is one of the main reasons why we do the bisque firing. The third thing that happens relative to the strengthening of the clay is that there are other chemical reactions that are going on at the same time. While the clay particles are sintering and joining together, there are chemical reactions going on, such as all the organic impurities in the clay. And different kinds of naturally occurring clays can contain varying levels of natural impurities. But there's a lot of organic material in some clay, carbon, essentially. And it could be in the form of pollen grains or just old vegetable matter that was deposited when the clay was deposited. Well, during the bisque firing, these organic materials either cook off and convert directly to gas, or they burn off, in which case they produce carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and water, and they're basically, hopefully, removed from the clay. A second fairly common reaction that occurs is there are also fairly commonly sulfur minerals and sulfur compounds that exist naturally in the clay, and these are converted to sulfur oxides, and these are driven off from the clay. So, for example, iron pyrite, the mineral iron pyrite or fool's gold, is a fairly common impurity in certain types of clay. And then when this is fired up to a high enough temperature, it's converted to sulfur oxides, and this is what comes off from the kiln. And you may have noticed this in the past, if you've ever been around a kiln during the bisque firing, there's sort of an acrid, stinky smell that's coming up, kind of a sulfurous smell. That is the sulfur coming off from the sulfur compounds in the clay. It also is this, we'll talk about a little bit about this later, it's also the source of a lot of the corrosion that occurs of the kiln, the metal parts, the bricks, etc., as a result of the bisque firing if the kiln isn't vented properly. Now, related to the second goal, or the second purpose, or the second occurrence that when we do the bisque firing, that is removing the water. Wet clay actually contains three different kinds or three different types of water. The first one is the absorbed water, and this is the normal water that you think of when you speak of, for instance, a sponge absorbing water. This is liquid water that is held in the spaces between these clay particles. That's the absorbed water. Then there's adsorbed water with a D, adsorbed water. This is a thin film of water molecules that's attached to all the surfaces in the clay. Even after the absorbed water has been removed, there is still a film of water molecules attached to the surface, the same way that everything in this room has a layer of adsorbed water molecules sticking to the surface of it, even though we can't see it. And the third kind of water is the chemical or structural water that's actually built into the atomic structure of the clay. Let me write a formula on the board here for a second. The formula for kaolinite, which is the most common, as we discussed, kaolinite is the most common, most prevalent clay mineral. And the formula for kaolinite is this. So that's one molecule of, or one unit of aluminum oxide, 2 of silica, and 2 of water. That's the chemical, that's called chemical or structural water, because it's actually a part of the crystal structure. This is not liquid water. It's actually present in the crystals in the form of what are called hydroxyl ions. And when the material is heated, the hydroxyl ions combine and change into water. But this is actually present in the crystal structure. And the reason why this is important is by weight in kaolinite, water is 14% by weight of the total weight of dried clay. So that if you take completely dried clay and you fire it, bisque fire it, it's going to lose weight by at least 14% just from the water coming from the clay structure itself. And once the water is removed from the clay structure, the structure can no longer be maintained. So this now becomes, the composition changes a little bit, but this now becomes something different. This now becomes a ceramic material. It's no longer clay. This is also what's referred to, if you've ever looked at references for clay, and they talk about what's called the LOI, or the loss on ignition. This is a major part of the loss on ignition. What they mean is the weight that's lost during the heating of the firing of the clay. So this is a significant contributor, well, probably the main one, to the loss on ignition, this weight that comes off. Okay, well, what's the point of all of this? Well, the point is that when it's heated, the different forms of water are removed at different temperatures. They don't all come off at one specific temperature. So, and another point relative to that is they also don't come off at the same time. So I'll keep mentioning this because this is why it's very important whenever you're doing a kiln firing to not only reach a certain temperature or provide enough heat for the firing, whatever the firing is, but for enough time for all the reactions that are involved to actually occur. So the first thing that happens during a bisque firing is the liquid water comes off. That evaporates and that's driven off. And then after a certain period of time and a little higher temperature, then the adsorbed water comes off. It takes a little more heat and a little more time to eliminate those last few molecules that are clinging to all the clay particle surfaces. And then finally, the latest stage is the chemical water comes off. The chemical water, you have to get roughly in the range of 750 to 1100 degrees Fahrenheit to eliminate all the chemical water. And it's a range because there are other factors that affect how easily the water comes off. Again, it's not, even though we talk about how water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, in a small quantity of water in a pot, that's true. But with the structural water and these water contained in the clay, the water does not come off at a specific temperature. It comes out over a range of temperature and a range of times. And there are other things that can also affect, besides just the form of the water, there are other factors that can affect how easily the water can be removed from the clay. One of them is particle size. Depending on how fine the individual particles are in the clay, this can affect how easily the water can be removed. The finer the clay particles are, the slower the water is able to come out of the clay. If there's grog or sand or fibers present in the clay, even in the form, let's say, paper clay, these particles actually provide a pathway for the water to come out of the clay more easily, so they tend to speed up the removal of the water. Even the pots themselves, if the pots have thicker walls, that's going to slow down and require more time for the water to come out when the pot walls are thicker. And finally, if the surfaces of the pots have been burnished, that will also slow down the removal of water. Most people don't think about that, but when you're burnishing clay, you're compressing the clay particles, and you're laying those little clay particles down like this, parallel to the surface. Well, that makes it a lot harder for the water to come up through them than if they're randomly arranged. So when we've burnished the material, we've packed the surface down and produced a denser layer, and that slows down the water removal. Okay, well, why does this matter? Well, it matters because it means that, as I mentioned earlier, bisque firing must provide enough temperature and time for all this to happen. And one of the things that's important about this is very early in the firing, the temperature has to be controlled very precisely to avoid steam explosions. The problem is when you have liquid water present, meaning, for instance, the pots, you may think the pots are dry, but they're not completely dry. The water, if the water is heated up too quickly and it turns to steam, it expands violently to the produce where it can actually blow up the pots. When water changes to steam, it actually increases in volume over 1,000 times. So essentially, when the water does boil instantly, at 212 it turns to steam. So when it reaches 212, it basically can produce a bomb in the pots. And the problem is that when the steam, if you have pots that are not completely dry and they get too hot too quickly, the water turns to steam. The pots don't just crack. If you see cracks in the pots after a bisque, that's probably not due to water. That's due to some other cause. The pots actually explode, and I've got a couple of examples here. This is a fairly nice sort of little squatty sort of pot, and the problem here is the whole bottom has blown off the pot as a result of the bisque firing. And the reason why this probably occurred is because the bottom was thicker. So although the upper portion of the pot didn't suffer any damage because it was thin enough for the water to come off, the bottom was thick and retained the water. This is also very characteristic of the form of explosions that you get with bisque firing. This is called spalling. And this is where there's at a certain depth in the clay, there's a point where the water is reached. The water has dried from the surface, and you get below the surface a certain amount, and you reach the water. Well, at that point, all of that water turns to steam, and it blows off the whole layer. So one of the characteristics of failures that you see from steam explosions are these surface layers being exploded off the piece like this. This is another example. This is a fairly nice bottle, only except the whole bottom is blown off. And again, this is a case where the upper portion is a reasonable thickness, and it probably dried out, the water was able to be removed, but the bottom is too thick. So in this case, it blew the whole bottom off. But you can see also where it tended to pop the surface off in sheets parallel to the surface. That's very characteristic of a water explosion.
We hope you're enjoying the show. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. It really helps new listeners find the show. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates as new episodes are released. And if you'd like to support the video and podcast production of the Potter's Roundtable, become a patron. Go to patreon.com and search for the Potter's Roundtable. Your support will help us achieve our goal of creating a digital library spanning the ceramic arts for use by educators and artists alike. Thank you for your support. Now let's get back to the show.
basically, when you're doing a bisque firing, you want to start the firing slowly at temperatures and stay well below 212 degrees Fahrenheit until all the liquid water is removed. Then you can speed up the heating rate and increase the temperature. You'll need to go for bisque firing, you need to go to at least 1200 degrees Fahrenheit approximately, which is about cone 019 to remove the chemical water. Now that says nothing about time, but you need to uniformly achieve that temperature throughout to break down this structure and remove the water. The time that's required to remove the water depends on several other factors in addition to what I mentioned already. How tightly loaded the kiln is affects how easily the water can be removed. If the pots are packed closely together, keeping in mind that with an electric kiln, all the heat is coming from the outside walls and working its way toward the center. So if the kiln is very densely loaded, it's going to take a long time for the pots in the center to get hot, even though the ones close to the elements on the outside of the shells may be quite hot. So you have to allow, it's going to take longer for a firing for that heat, for the heat to get to the center. The wall thicknesses of the pots, even if you're not going too quickly, if the pots have very thick walls, it's going to take a longer time for the clay to get uniformly heated and drive the water out. And even, as I mentioned earlier, the type of clay. If it contains, the particle size of the clay, whether it contains grog or it doesn't contain grog or fibers, that affects the time that's required for getting the temperature. That affects the time that's required to remove the water. Once the chemical water has been removed, during the bisque firing, then the temperature can be increased further to do two things. You can remove more impurities. Some impurities and compounds are not broken down until you get to higher temperatures. So you might by going to a higher temperature, you're cleaning up the clay basically more thoroughly. And the other thing you're doing is you're strengthening the clay. The higher temperature you bisque fire, the more these particles tend to bond together and the stronger the clay becomes. And the porosity of the clay, the remaining holes or pores, decrease as the particles get, the bonding of the particles gets tighter and tighter. Lower bisque temperatures, therefore, produce softer, more porous bisque. And the effect we see, there are two effects you might see from that is that it might get, if the bisque firing temperature is too low, the material, the clay can actually be fragile when you're handling it for glaze firing. So typically you want to bisque it at a higher notch temperature to make it easily handleable. So you're not worried about damaging it by holding it. And the other effect you see is low bisque temperatures. At low bisque temperatures, the clay is more porous. So when you're glazing them, you'll see more glaze absorption, or you'll see a thicker glaze layer will build up faster because more water is being absorbed into the clay, pulling more glaze onto the surface of the pots. Over-bisquing, meaning going to a temperature that's higher than you anticipated or higher than you desired, is not really a problem. The major effect you're going to see is you'll get less glaze absorption, or you'll get slower glaze absorption. So if you're dipping pots in a bucket of glaze and you know that they've been bisque fired to a higher temperature, you might have to hold them in the glaze for a longer period in order to accumulate the normal level of glaze deposition. So for typical bisque firing temperatures, earthenware in general, you are actually doing a true bisque. For most earthenware, low temperature ware, it is recommended that you bisque firing at least 04 and then you glaze fire at 06. And the reason for this is the fact that with earthenware, the bisque firing temperature and the glaze firing temperature are so close together, you want to make sure that the clay has been fairly cleaned of all these impurities before you glaze it. Because if you don't get all the impurities out, what happens during the glaze firing is the impurities continue to break down and produce gas, and the gas bubbles up through the clay and produces two kinds of defects. Either pinholes, which are tiny little holes of bubble streams that come up through the glaze, or with maiolica, and this is particularly prevalent in a lot of maiolica, you get white spots in the colored areas. Maiolica or majolica, is where basically you typically have a colored clay body and you have a opaque white surface glaze, and then thin layers of color are applied to the top. What happens if there's gas coming off, while the glaze is liquid, the bubbles come up through the white glaze and carry the white glaze with it, and it bubbles up through the colored layers on the surface. So you end up with small white spots in the colored areas on the surface. And that's very typical of a clay body that has not been thoroughly cleaned as a result of the bisque firing. Stoneware and porcelain, basically, you only need to get hot enough to remove the pots, to remove the impurities and make the pots handleable. I typically use when I'm bisque firing for stoneware porcelain, I typically bisque fire in the range of 07 to 06, which is 1789 roughly to 1815 degrees Fahrenheit. The choice of temperature depends on several things, what you decide to do. One is the type of clay. How dirty is the clay? Certain kinds of clay and clay bodies contain a lot more impurities than others, and you will know, or you will find out that you need to bisque fire them more thoroughly, slightly higher temperature or a longer time to remove more of the impurities so you don't get some of these glaze defects when you do the glaze firing. Another consideration is how strong do you want the pottery to be for handling? Porcelain, for example, if it isn't bisque fired high enough, can be a lot more fragile, especially since a lot of times the pieces are thinner, if it isn't bisque fired adequately. So you have to decide what kind of clay are you using, and how do you like what consistency do you like the clay to be when you're handling it for glazing? And also related to that is, what kind of glazing characteristics do you like? Do you like the glaze to be absorbed quickly, or do you want it more slowly, in which case it would take longer maybe to build up a certain glaze thickness, but you might have better control of the thickness that way. And finally, there's also an issue with control of the interface of what's called the interfacial layer, which is the layer in a fired glaze that forms between the glaze and the clay body. Some people believe that by going to a lower initial bisque firing temperature, you can affect the way that interfacial layer develops, which affects the way the final glaze looks. I personally don't subscribe to that, because if you think about it, if you're glaze firing at a higher temperature, in the early part of the glaze firing, you essentially are going through a higher temperature bisque. So even if you initially bisque at a low temperature, when you're doing the glaze firing, you're going back through and rebisquing essentially at a higher temperature long before the glaze ever melts. But I think that would require more work to really demonstrate that that's true. It doesn't do any harm, but I don't know. I'm not sure whether that's a really actual effect. With underbisquing, if all the chemical water is not removed, and this is what I'm just saying, is that it will come out when you do the higher glaze firing. So even if you haven't completely removed all the chemical water during the bisque firing, when you go to a higher glaze firing temperature, you're essentially, the early part of the firing is a rebisquing. And so you will get a chance to remove all the water. But if you haven't removed all the impurities during the underbisque, they will come out during the higher glaze firing, and you'll produce some of these glaze defects. During bisque firing, there's only a little shrinkage of the clay that actually occurs, roughly 0.5%. So there's very little chance of warping during a bisque firing. The other thing is that during a bisque firing, the clay really doesn't get sticky because there's little or no vitrification, meaning there's little or no melting or glass formation that's occurring during the firing. So pots can touch one another. When you load the pots for bisque firing, they can touch and they can actually be nested, meaning to save space. And I've got a diagram here that illustrates that. So this is an example of how you could nest pots. I could have two bowls, for example, that one sits inside another, and I could have a third one inside here. That's okay. This arrangement is fine because the pots are basically free to move. I said there isn't much shrinkage. There's a little bit, but not a lot. But this way, the pots are essentially free to move, and they're only resting on the foot ring. So the pots are essentially isolated from each other. You can also do this. You could put something completely flat across the rim because, again, this slab is free to shrink slightly. The rim of this lower bowl is free to move a little bit. This, however, is not a good arrangement. And the problem here is there's no guarantee that even if they're made out of the same clay, that two pots in the same firing are going to shrink exactly the same amount. So the problem with this arrangement is that the rim of the lower bowl is being restrained by the upper bowl. If the lower bowl doesn't shrink quite as much or wants to shrink more than the upper bowl, it can't. And so typically then I'd get a rim crack. So you can, the pieces when you load for bisque firing can touch, they can be nested or layered like this. I could put one upside down, rim to rim, and then I could stack it like rim to rim and then base to rim. But you don't want any pot restraining the little bit of movement that does occur of the other pieces. So finally, some suggestions for bisque firing. So the firing schedule, whatever you decide to do, should be planned for what I'm going to call the worst pot in the firing. That is, what pot has the thickest walls, or what pot is made of the dirtiest clay. That's the one that you want to have in mind when you design the firing. When in doubt, go slower. As I mentioned previously, there's an old saying in pottery, there are a lot of things you can mess up by going too quickly. There's almost nothing you can hurt by going too slowly. Make sure that the preheating, if you're doing any kind of a preheating or drying cycle, make sure that you're well below 212 degrees. And some kilns come with they'll have actually a setting on it, some of the electronic controls as a preheat, but make sure still that when it's preheating, it's well below, meaning 180 degrees or 150 degrees, well below 212. Don't go to 200. That's too close. And the point is that if the kiln is going to get to, let's say, 200 degrees, then right next to the element, I can guarantee it's hotter than 212. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing to an initial drying or preheating stage, that all of the pots are staying well below 212, because that's where the liquid water would convert to steam and blow up your pots. Another suggestion is put thicker pots toward the center of the shelves. We know that all the heat is coming from the outside, so if you can put your thicker pots toward the center, it slows down the heating of them, and they have more of a chance for the water to be removed, less of a chance to blow up. As far as just the kiln setup itself, you can actually flip the shelves over during a bisque firing and have the kiln wash on the bottom side. This is a chance to even out some of the stress on kiln shelves, because if a little bit of, normally you would always want the kiln wash up, you wouldn't want the kiln wash on the bottom because it'll stick to the glaze. But in this case, if a little bit of kiln wash flakes off the shelves and lands on the bisque pots, it's not going to stick. It doesn't melt. The pots aren't getting sticky, and it's just dust that you can brush off. But it gives you a chance to fire the shelves in another orientation and hopefully relieve some of the stress from always being fired the same way, right side up. Just as a note also, bisquing is generally done in electric kilns, and the reason for that is because the earliest part of the firing is when the temperature control is the most critical, and that's a really hard thing to achieve in a gas or a wood kiln. So it's generally done in an electric kiln. It doesn't have to be, but it generally is done. But even if it's done in a gas kiln, you need oxidation conditions to burn out all the impurities, the carbon and the other impurities. So even if you're doing it in a gas kiln, the early part of the firing, the bisque firing, needs to be an oxidation. If you're doing single firing, where you don't do a separate bisque, you're basically glazing greenware or you're glazing leather hard pots, then you still need to have the first portion of that single firing cycle still needs to be essentially a bisque firing. You need to go slowly enough so that the water can be removed, all the other processes we're talking about, long before the glaze starts to melt. So essentially, you still need to perform a bisque, you're just not unloading the kiln and reloading the kiln. Another thing, of course, as I mentioned before, is make sure the pots, if you can, are air dry them thoroughly before you put them into the kiln. That's if you have problems with maybe some of the pots are a little too close to the elements, at least if they're thoroughly dry, then you're not going to get steam explosions early in the firing. So you need to determine the best firing cycle, essentially, for your type of work and your clay, the kind that you're using. There's no one universal perfect bisque firing cycle. As an example, for instance, we have kilns here at the studio that have L&L kilns that have an electronic controller, and we also have a kiln vent. So when I do bisque firings for our cone 6, what are going to be cone 6 glaze firings, I bisque fire typically at 06. And the cycle that I use is I preheat anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, depending on how perfectly dry I think the pieces might be or might not be. And then I do a slow bisque cycle to cone 07, which is roughly 1789 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I add a 35-minute hold at the end. And the reason why I do that is I found out I get much more uniform heating by adding the hold on the end and allowing the temperature to equalize rather than just going directly to cone 06 and shutting the kiln off. And I've put cones in the kilns and tested and mapped the kiln basically, and I found I get much more uniform results by doing that. And by essentially holding for 35 minutes, I am adding the equivalent of another cone to the firing. Because when I put cones in, cone 6 goes down very nicely. But I'm doing that by adding time rather than just adding temperature. When in the past and at other times when I fired with a manual kiln, one of the things I want to do where I don't have all the conveniences of electronic controllers, I want the kiln firing to suit my schedule. I don't want to have to live according to the kiln. So I found a good cycle was where I had a manual kiln with manual switches, I'd put the kiln on low overnight, and I'd have the lid propped up a half an inch or an inch, and I'd have all the peepholes, the peep plugs out, so the peepholes are open. Then the next morning, I'd turn the kiln up to medium, I'd put the lid down, but I'd still leave the peepholes open. And this is allowing now that during medium, on what's sort of general medium on most manual kilns, that's where actually you're going to get into red heat and where most of the chemical water is going to be driven off. So I leave the peepholes open to allow the fumes to come out of the kiln, but I close the lid so that I'm not fighting the fact that I'm wasting all the heat. And then finally, late in the afternoon, I'll turn the kiln up to high. By that point, most of the water has actually been removed from the clay. At this point, I'm going to a higher temperature to strengthen the clay. So I'll turn the kiln up to high, I'll close the top peep, and typically I found it only takes an hour or 2 hours on high to finish the firing to reach the final temperature. The last thing, the last issue to mention relative to bisque firing is you want to vent the kiln and you want to vent the room. The fumes that are coming off during a bisque firing are particularly the sulfur fumes are particularly corrosive to everything in the kiln. They'll corrode the elements, they'll corrode any metal fixtures on the kiln, the controller. They actually will attack the bricks on the kiln. So you can either use the peepholes or prop the lid up to allow the fumes to come out, or if you have a downdraft kiln vent, that will remove the fumes from the kiln. The second thing is you want to vent the room because these fumes are not healthy to breathe over a long period of time. You want to avoid respiratory problems. So get these corrosive fumes out of the kiln and then also get them out of the room. You don't want to sit around and breathe them forever. So that's all we had today for this topic. I hope that this was useful information for you. If you'd like to support our educational efforts, you can go to patreon.com and search for the Potter's Roundtable. And also check out our website, www.hfclay.com. This topic today was on bisque firing. The next topic will be on tips for successful glazing. Assuming you've done a successful bisque, we'll be talking about tips for glazing, the next logical step in the series. So thank you for visiting us.
The Potter's Roundtable is brought to you by Washington Street Studios and our patrons. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and tell your friends. If you want to learn more about Washington Street Studios and shared studio memberships, please visit our website at www.hfclay.com. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time on the Potter's Roundtable.